He was born not into comfort, but into duty, not into laughter and lullabies, but into hushed corridors, stiff silences, and the cold formality of a royal court that did not know how to cradle a child, only how to mold a monarch. George William Frederick, the boy who would become King George III, came into this world on a grey morning in 1738, under the looming shadow of palaces that echoed with legacy and power. A child wrapped not only in silk and lace but in the burdens of a lineage that demanded obedience to the crown above all else. He was quiet, curious, often withdrawn even as a child, more prone to watching than speaking, more likely to recite a passage of scripture than run and laugh in the gardens. And though he was a grandson of a king, his path to power was never meant to be soft or sentimental. His education was rigorous, steeped in Greek, Latin, history, and moral philosophy. His hours measured by tutors rather than time, his future outlined not in hopes and dreams but in obligations and expectations. And so from an early age, George learned how to carry the weight of being watched, of being shaped, of being prepared, not as a man, but as a symbol. When his father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, died suddenly in 1751, the 11-year-old George became heir apparent. And the shadow that fell over him then was colder than death, the quiet realization that childhood was over, and that every smile, every mistake, every hesitation would now belong not to a boy, but to the future king of Great Britain. And when his grandfather, King George II, died in 1760, George ascended the throne at just 22, chaste, disciplined, and surprisingly earnest. Unlike the indulgent kings before him, he was no gambler, no womanizer, no winesome caricature of royalty, but a man who believed sincerely in virtue, in family, in faith, a man who saw kingship not as privilege, but as divine responsibility, a role to be fulfilled with moral clarity and discipline. And at first, the people loved him for it, this young king who walked upright, who married Queen Charlotte and stayed loyal to her, who fathered a brood of children not with courtesans, but within the sanctity of marriage, who read books, avoided scandal, and spoke in measured tones. And yet, beneath the surface, there was always a certain fragility, a stiffness in his smile, a tension in his gaze. The kind of weight that cannot be seen but is always felt, the tremble of a soul trying too hard to hold everything together. And as the British Empire stretched its fingers across continents, from the sugar plantations of the Caribbean to the jewel-laden lands of India, one place in particular was growing restless. The American colonies, 13 strips of ambition and defiance lining the eastern edge of a vast, untamed wilderness, where British settlers had carved out lives under the illusion of shared identity, only to find themselves more and more at odds with the very crown they were meant to revere. George, who had never set foot in America, saw the colonies as his rightful subjects, British in blood, British in loyalty, and British in obedience. And when Parliament, facing financial strain after costly wars, imposed taxes like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, the colonists howled with protest, not against monarchy per se, but against being taxed without a voice in Parliament, without representation, without dignity. And George, isolated in his palatial world of ministers and memorandums, mistook these protests not as cries for fairness but as insults, affronts, and ultimately as treason. To him, the monarchy was sacred, the empire ordained, and the colonists' refusal to comply was not political dissent, it was rebellion against the will of God and King. As tensions flared and protests turned to riots, George became increasingly obsessed with restoring order, pushing Parliament toward harsher measures, stoking the fire with punishments and proclamations, until the colonies, feeling cornered and unheard, chose the unthinkable independence. The Declaration of Independence in 1776 did not merely mark a historical shift. It detonated something deep inside George, something unspoken and fragile. Because in those 1,300 words penned by Jefferson and signed by rebels, he saw not just the loss of land or taxes, but the shattering of royal authority, the rejection of everything he had tried to uphold, the severing of a sacred bond between king and subject, and the betrayal cut deeper than any sword ever could. From that moment, something in him began to crack, a hairline fracture along the mind's surface, invisible at first, but destined to spread. While armies clashed across valleys and frozen rivers, while men like Washington rose from humble beginnings to lead a revolution, George stayed behind, pacing the grand halls of Windsor and Kew, poring over reports with shaking hands, composing letter after letter, sometimes dozens in a day, each one more erratic, more emotional, more fragmented, as if he could write his way back to order, back to sanity, back to control. His ministers noticed the change, the stammering, the repetition, The long digressions into philosophy or prayer, the moments when he seemed to lose his train of thought mid-sentence and stare into nothing, as if listening to voices only he could hear. And at night, the palace grew quieter, darker, as the king wandered its corridors alone, whispering to himself, muttering names and numbers, slipping deeper into the fog of his own unraveling mind, even as he refused to let go of the war, even as defeat became inevitable. And after the British army surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, George refused to believe it. He called it a setback, insisted the colonies would return, denied the truth until it dissolved even the reality around him. Physicians were called, not to treat a fever or wound, but to make sense of what they dared not name madness. And as 1788 approached, George suffered a complete breakdown. No longer a monarch but a man possessed by confusion, by sorrow, by fire. He spoke without pause, his words tumbling over each other like waves in a storm. He raved about sin and scripture, claimed to converse with angels and plants, went days without sleep, collapsed in fits of agony, begged for forgiveness, for crimes he could not name, until his own family feared him, and his court could no longer pretend all was well. Queen Charlotte, devoted yet terrified, watched her husband slip further from reach, as their children whispered in hallways, and Parliament debated replacing the king with his own son as regent, a betrayal George sensed even through the fog, clinging to moments of lucidity like a drowning man to driftwood, refusing to be cast aside. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the storm broke in early 1789. George recovered, miraculously, shockingly, and for a brief time, the nation rejoiced. Church bells rang, portraits were painted, parades marched in his honor. The king was back, they said. The madness was gone, order had returned, but those closest to him knew better. The recovery was a reprieve, not a cure, a borrowed breath before the drowning resumed. And as the years passed, and Europe exploded in revolution, as monarchs were guillotined and empires fell, George again grew silent, strange, forgetful, withdrawn. The madness had returned, colder now, more complete, and by 1811, his son was officially appointed regent, ruling in his place as George, now blind, now deaf, now broken, lived out his days in Windsor Castle like a ghost wandering his own life, sitting for hours in silence, or humming hymns with a voice no longer touched by reason. A man who once ruled the mightiest empire on earth, now unable to recognize his own reflection. And in those final years, as winter crept across the windows of Windsor, George was no longer king in anything but title. He was simply a man, a father, a husband, a soul unraveling. And when he died in January 1820, the world he had once governed barely noticed, too consumed with the battles and ambitions of a new century, too eager to move forward, to linger on the tragedy of a man who had tried so hard to do right, only to lose everything: his colonies, his people, and finally, his mind.